In a nationally televised Senate hearing, Jasmine Crockett stares down Mike Pence as he defends a $12 billion border wall, while 27 million Americans remain uninsured and hospitals shut their doors. Emotions explode as Crockett unveils leaked budget cuts, shows a dying child's photo, and asks a question that silences the room and splits the nation. Under the blinding Capitol lights, it's not just policy on trial, it's America's soul. Two leaders, two futures, one nation held hostage by its own priorities. If we can afford walls to keep people out, why are we letting our own citizens die inside them? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding rotunda lights of the U.S. Capitol, every camera locked in place, every seat in the hearing chamber filled to the brim, not with idle spectators, but with the power brokers of a fractured nation. A cold hush rolled over the room as former Vice President Mike Pence stepped forward, crisp navy suit pressed like doctrine, silver tie gleaming like polished steel. He carried a thick black binder labeled Border Security 2030, embossed in gold. $12 billion worth of concrete, steel, surveillance drones, and a doctrine he believed would save the republic. His face bore no uncertainty. This was his crusade, his moment to lead the nation back to God and order, as he once told donors behind closed doors. As he took his seat at the center table, the seal of the United States gleamed behind him like a halo cast in authority. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat silent, but her silence burned. No scripted speech, no entourage, just a worn folder in her lap, filled with names of those who died waiting for care. Her eyes locked on Pence, not with hatred, but with the sharp focus of a surgeon before a cut. She knew this wasn't just about numbers. It was about the soul of the nation. Pence came to build a wall. She came to tear one down, the invisible one that let the sick die quietly while Congress called it order. She came to tear down the wall, but first she had to let him build it, brick by brick, with numbers, fear, and the thunder of moral certainty. Mike Pence leaned forward into the microphone, his fingertips touching as if in prayer, eyes narrowing with practiced gravity. "This is not just steel and concrete," he began, his voice calm but heavy, like a sermon delivered at the edge of a grave. "This wall, this initiative, is a moral line in the sand." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room like dust. "It is a barrier against chaos, against the fentanyl that's murdering our children, the human traffickers exploiting our women, and the foreign agents who walk in without a second glance." Then came the paper, smooth, white, presented like sacred text. He held it up with both hands, the seal of Homeland Security gleaming in the corner. 38% of fentanyl, he said slowly, each word deliberate, entered the United States through our southern border just last year. Gas moved through the chamber, not spontaneous but orchestrated, a performance of alarm. A senator beside him leaned back, arms crossed in agreement. Behind him, aides scribbled notes, already preparing sound bites for the 6 o'clock news. Pence nodded solemnly, as if sealing the moral case. "What kind of nation," he continued, "watches its youth die and chooses to do nothing?" He didn't look at Jasmine Crockett. Not yet. But his words were aimed like a missile. He was building a fortress of righteousness and laying its foundation in blood and statistics. And still across the table, Jasmine didn't flinch. Not because the number wasn't horrifying. It was. But because she knew what he wasn't saying. That most of that fentanyl came not from desperate migrants crossing deserts, but from ports, trucks, and legal checkpoints the wall would never touch. But Pence wasn't here to dissect complexity. He was here to declare war. And in his war, steel was salvation, and silence was complicity. He wasn't here to dissect complexity. He was here to declare war. And now he reached for the weapon that silences most rooms, a grieving American family. Pence tilted his head solemnly and raised his hand, signaling to the aides behind him. The monitors flickered, then settled on a still image, a living room frozen in loss. A middle-aged couple sat shoulder to shoulder on a worn beige sofa, their hands interlocked but trembling. The father, a former Navy man by the look of his faded sleeve tattoo, stared straight ahead, eyes glassed over. The mother clutched a framed photo of a teenage boy in graduation robes, smiling wide, frozen in the moment before everything shattered. A small urn sat on the coffee table, its brass edges catching the light like accusation. "This is the Collins family," Pence said, letting the name hover in the air like it carried divine weight. They lost their only son, Jacob, to a drunk driving accident caused by an undocumented immigrant, someone who had been deported not once but twice, someone who should have never been here. He stood still for a beat, letting the silence deepen like a held breath. "They don't want revenge," he continued softly. "They want justice. They want us to mean what we say when we claim this is a nation of laws." His voice tightened, not with emotion, but with calculation. "And so I ask, if we can spend billions on foreign wars, why can't we spend a fraction of that to protect the families inside our own borders?" The image lingered, the boy's smile now a ghostly counterpoint to the stillness in the room. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the harshest critics didn't dare interrupt grief when wrapped in the flag. The camera panned to Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't touched her microphone. Her hands rested quietly on the worn folder in her lap. Still, but her knuckles were white. Her gaze didn't waver. The room wasn't quiet out of respect. It was quiet because something was shifting, because behind those eyes something fierce and calculated was beginning to turn. She wasn't untouched by the pain on the screen, but she could see what Pence was doing and what was missing. And in that silence, she wasn't mourning. She was measuring the weight of the story he had chosen against the thousands he had left out. She had let him speak, let him weaponize grief and statistics, let him lay each brick of his moral fortress with polished certainty, while the chamber sat still, hypnotized by a single boy's death. But Jasmine Crockett knew silence was not surrender. Silence was strategy, and when she finally stood, it wasn't with fury, it was with purpose, the kind of quiet that storms gather before lightning strikes. The chair behind her shifted back with a soft scrape, the only sound in the marble echo of the Capitol hearing room. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't look to the press row or the aides scribbling behind Pence. She looked only at him, at the man who had just made a wall sound like salvation. And then, with deliberate calm, she spoke. "You built a wall to keep people out," she began, each syllable shaped like a scalpel. "But who's going to build a wall to keep our conscience from collapsing in on itself?" Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried with it something far more potent than volume: moral clarity. The words dropped into the silence like stones in still water, sending ripples through every row. Pence blinked but didn't move. The chairman shifted slightly in his seat. And then Jasmine turned, not dramatically, not for effect, and tapped her finger on the touchscreen in front of her. The main screen behind her blinked once, twice, then came alive, not with a flag, not with a grieving family framed in patriotic lighting, but with something raw, something no strategist would ever show. A grainy photo of a hallway inside St. Andrews County Hospital in East Texas. The camera angle was crooked, as if taken by someone too tired to hold their phone straight. The fluorescent lights above buzzed in frozen motion, some of them dim or flickering. Along the hallway were bodies, not dead, but exhausted, slumped, waiting. A woman in a faded t-shirt held a limp child to her chest, rocking slightly. Beside her, a man sat with his head tilted back, eyes closed, holding a bloodied cloth to his side. Nurses moved between them like ghosts, their scrubs wrinkled, shoes worn, expressions hollow. "This is what's happening right now," Jasmine said, still calm. "Not on the border, not in some distant war zone. Right here, in our country, in my state." She tapped again. The photo changed. Now it was a waiting room, if you could call it that. Children asleep on cold tile floors, a sign on the wall. Next available appointment, 9 hours minimum. One nurse behind the reception glass, answering phones with one hand while filling prescriptions with the other. "This is not a disaster caused by foreign criminals," Jasmine continued, her eyes never leaving Pence. "This is the disaster caused by neglect, by indifference, by the conscious political decision, to fund steel instead of stitches. Her voice grew tighter, like a rope being drawn across the chest. We're spending $12 billion to build a wall that won't stop a virus, won't treat asthma, won't revive a child whose lungs have filled with fluid while waiting on a bench outside an ER. She let that image sit, let it burn. And then she said it, the sentence that felt like it cracked the marble under their feet. In the United States of America, you can die of pneumonia because you don't have a plastic card in your wallet, and that is perfectly legal. No one dared interrupt her. The sentence didn't echo. It just hung there, pulsing, like a fire alarm no one knew how to silence. She didn't blink. She didn't sit. She let the gravity of it settle like a verdict. Then she turned back to the image on the screen. That little girl in the photo, her name was Alina, 6 years old. She died 2 weeks after this photo was taken. Not from anything exotic, not from anything rare. She died from a condition treatable with $40 worth of antibiotics. But her mother didn't have insurance, and the clinic was full, and the ambulance took too long. She inhaled slowly, not dramatically but deliberately, as if the act of breathing itself was an act of restraint. I wonder, Mr. Pence, she said, her voice low now, almost intimate, how many Alinas it takes to build the foundation of your wall? She didn't need applause. She didn't want it. What she wanted, what she had, was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from politeness, but from impact. From the collective realization that something sacred had just been broken open in front of them. Behind her, the screen remained frozen on Alina's face, not smiling, not angelic, just tired. A little girl, feverish and waiting, caught between a broken system and a budget that called her expendable. A child who never made it into a speech or a campaign video or a primetime headline, but now finally into the record. And Jasmine Crockett stood there, not angry, not loud, but unshaken, because she knew the truth Pence had avoided. The wall he praised could never save a child like Alina, and no amount of steel could shield a government from the consequences of abandoning its own. Alina's image still hovered on the screen like a ghost that refused to leave, her wide, glassy eyes staring into the chamber's collective conscience. The silence she left behind was not the kind that invited comfort. It demanded reckoning. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless for a moment longer, allowing the weight of one child's death to sink into the marble and minds around her. But she wasn't here just to mourn. She was here to indict. Without breaking eye contact with the panel, she reached into her leather folder and retrieved a stack of papers, edges dog-eared, sections underlined in red, notes scrawled by hand in the margins. She lifted the first page into view like it was a weapon forged in truth. Let's stop pretending this is just about tragedy, she said, her voice stripped of all softness. Let's talk about decisions. Cold, calculated, printed on government letterhead decisions. She stepped toward the center of the dais, holding the document high enough for the cameras to catch every seal, every signature. This is an internal budget allocation memo from the Office of Management and Budget. Dated 3 months ago, it outlines $12.06 billion allocated for enhanced border infrastructure and operational security. That includes reinforced walls, sensor grids, tactical drones, and new detention facilities in Texas, Arizona, and California, all greenlit, all fast-tracked. She flipped to the second page. Her tone grew sharper. And here, on line item 42, is a cut, a $1.2 billion slash from the Community Health Block Grant Program. Gone. Stripped from rural clinics, prenatal care, and vaccination outreach. The very programs that could have saved Alina, that could still save thousands like her. The hearing room grew tenser with every word, like the oxygen was slowly being pulled from the air. Jasmine's next step echoed on the marble floor as she walked the length of the bench, locking eyes with the senators seated before her. $12 billion for fences, she said, pausing with purpose. But not a dime for the doctors trying to keep premature infants alive in underfunded county hospitals. She held up the report again and slapped it gently for emphasis. A tenth of this border wall budget, just a tenth, could fully fund vaccine distribution for 500,000 unprotected American children. She let that number hang in the air, then said it again, slower, each syllable delivered like a verdict. 500,000 children. Her voice didn't shake, but it no longer needed to rise. It had dropped to a deeper register, a place of fury that didn't explode but carved through stone. And you chose steel. She turned back toward the projector, where Alina's photo still lingered. You call it national defense, she said, nodding slightly at Pence. I call it national betrayal. Her voice softened only for a moment, the way thunder does just before another bolt of lightning. Because this government didn't run out of money. It ran out of mercy. A hush fell again, but this time it trembled. Because numbers don't lie, and Crockett had just weaponized the truth in a way even the most seasoned spin doctors couldn't deflect. She had laid bare the ledger of priorities, and in its columns were bricks and barbed wire on one side, and the lifeless body of a 6-year-old girl on the other. She had just laid out the numbers like autopsy reports. Clinical, undeniable, devastating. The truth was bleeding across the chamber floor, but Pence wasn't ready to yield. He sat straighter in his seat, fixing his gaze forward, the weight of age and ideology bracing his spine like armor. His voice, when it came, was no longer calm. It was the steely cadence of a man clinging to a worldview crumbling beneath him. Without security, he declared, his hand tightening into a fist against the table, there is no nation. Without order, there is no future. His eyes didn't seek connection. They searched for control. Borders are not just lines. They are lifelines. They keep danger out so that we can build safety within, so that mothers can tuck in their children without fear of traffickers, cartels, or killers slipping through the cracks. He leaned in slightly, jaw clenched, emphasizing each syllable like the ticking of a countdown. A country that fails to defend its own perimeter cannot survive. That is not fear-mongering. That is history. His voice, now louder, filled the chamber like the clanging of a distant alarm. Without security, there is no America. For a moment, the room stood suspended, not because his words were new, but because they were spoken with the weight of legacy, of all the administrations that had stood before him invoking the same defense, the same righteous shield of law and order. Some nodded in approval, others sat stiff, unreadable. The tension had shifted again, like a fault line threatening to crack. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't glance at the chairman or the audience or the cameras. Her attention was fixed, laser sharp, on the man who had just tried to turn fear into virtue. And then, with devastating precision, she stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was quieter now. Not weak, but sharpened, like a blade honed over fire. You say without security, there is no America, she echoed, each word deliberate. But I say without doctors, there are no Americans. The sentence struck not with volume, but with gravity, a truth that fell like lead. What are you defending, Mr. Pence? A border? A flag? A set of coordinates on a map? She took another step, the sound of her heels like a judge approaching the bench. You speak of lifelines. Let me tell you what a real lifeline looks like. It's a Medicaid-funded clinic in a rural town where one nurse works 12-hour shifts to treat 300 patients a week. It's a pediatrician driving 40 miles to check on a child with a fever because the county has no hospital left. That's the line between life and death for millions, and your budget just erased it. Her voice didn't rise. It descended down into the marrow of the moment. You want to keep people out. I want to keep people alive. She turned slowly toward the full committee, meeting each gaze, daring them to flinch. Because a wall won't treat cancer, a drone won't deliver insulin, and no child has ever been saved by barbed wire. She returned her eyes to Pence, and with a final, devastating breath, she said, You can secure the perimeter all you want, but if you let the people inside rot, then you're not defending a country. You're preserving a corpse. And with that, the air collapsed into silence once more. Only this time, it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of reckoning. The screen flared to life again, and this time the air in the hearing room shifted. It wasn't a high-production video, no campaign music, no polished narration. What appeared was raw, unfiltered, The kind of footage too real for press releases and too painful for prime time. Jasmine Crockett had queued up exactly 60 seconds of truth, captured by a trembling hand in a dying man's breath. The footage began with the view jerking wildly, the lens adjusting to fading daylight outside a small clinic in Montgomery, Alabama. The clinic doors were shut, their glass covered with paper signs fluttering slightly in the breeze. One of them read, "Permanently closed, funding terminated." Slumped on a rusted metal bench below it was Tyrell Mason, a 43-year-old warehouse worker, collapsed sideways, mouth agape, lungs heaving like a dying engine. His face was pale and wet with sweat, his lips cracked. In his hand was a paper bag stained with condensation. Inside it, a nearly empty inhaler and a bottle of expired prednisone. On his lap, crumpled and smeared with sweat, was a rejection letter from Medicaid. "Coverage denied due to administrative delay." The voice behind the camera trembled. "Somebody help, please. He's not breathing right." The camera tilted slightly, catching the small figure of a girl kneeling beside the man's legs. Terrell's daughter. No older than 10, her knees scraped, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders. She was whispering, "Daddy! Daddy, wake up!" Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She just kept shaking his arm, trying to pull him upright, as if her tiny hands could reverse what the system had allowed to happen. There was no final frame, no conclusion, just the image freezing as Tyrell's body slumped further forward, his daughter's voice calling his name one last time, and then the screen went black. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. A few senators shifted in their seats, but most stared straight ahead, caught between horror and the knowledge that this wasn't a tragedy, it was a consequence. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Her voice was low, but it carried like steel dragged across granite. That man, Tyrell Mason, lived 43 years in this country. He paid his taxes. He obeyed the laws. He showed up to work even when his lungs were failing him. She held up a printed photo of him, not from the video, but from a happier time, holding his daughter on his shoulders at a county fair, both of them laughing, mouths wide with joy. He didn't need a wall. He needed a doctor. He needed a functioning clinic. He needed his government to prioritize his breath over your bricks. Her hand trembled slightly, not from nerves, but restraint. Terrell didn't die on a battlefield. He died in front of a locked door. A door that was closed because $1.2 billion was cut from the very programs meant to keep it open, while $12 billion went to build barriers hundreds of miles away. She turned to face Pence directly, locking eyes without hesitation. "You keep talking about invaders, but what invaded Terrell's life wasn't a stranger crossing a border. It was bureaucracy. It was abandonment. It was the kind of legislative cowardice that lets a father die 5 feet from help, because he filled out the wrong form." Then came the line, spoken not for soundbite, but like a eulogy. "Your wall may keep people out, but it didn't stop death from walking straight past it, into a man's lungs, and stealing him from his daughter while she knelt beside him." And the screen behind her remained dark, because nothing more needed to be shown. The truth had already done its job. It had made them look, and now it dared them to speak. The image of Tyrell and his daughter still hung in the minds of everyone in that chamber. But Pence, ever the tactician, moved swiftly to seize the moment and flip it on its head. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned back into the microphone with a tone laced in gravity and subtle accusation. "Let us not lose sight," he said, "of the simple fact that a nation without strong borders is not a nation at all." His voice steadied, gaining traction like a sermon building toward judgment. "While I mourn every American lost to systemic flaws, we cannot, we must not, allow sympathy to dismantle security." He turned ever so slightly toward Jasmine without naming her, but the intent was clear. Some in this chamber would have us abandon enforcement, tear down protection, open every gate in the name of compassion. But compassion without structure is chaos, and no civilization in history has survived without protecting its perimeter. He paused, letting his words settle like a gavel strike. "This is not about cruelty. This is about continuity. There is no America if there are no borders." But before the applause could even find its rhythm, Jasmine leaned forward, not out of anger, but resolve sharpened into precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke as if delivering a quiet verdict in a courtroom that had just lied under oath. And there is no greatness in a country that lets its own people die quietly within those borders. Her gaze never wavered. You say a nation cannot survive without walls? I say it cannot call itself decent if those walls serve only to keep others out while the citizens inside bleed without help. Her voice pressed harder with each word, drawing the attention of every camera, every breath in the room. You talk about survival, but survival without dignity is not a nation. It's a fortress of denial wrapped in flags. Then she paused, and in the stillness, delivered the line that cracked like thunder. No nation worth defending lets its citizens die on its own soil. Not from invasion, but from indifference. And with that, the chamber didn't just fall silent. It braced itself. Because her words had made one thing undeniable. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about who the nation was willing to protect and who it was willing to forget. The silence following her last sentence felt like something sacred had been broken. No one moved. Not because they were frozen in respect, but because they were cornered. Jasmine Crockett stood at the edge of that silence, not retreating, not basking in it, but using it. Her breath was measured, her grip on the folder tight. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The tremble in the room now came from the weight of unspoken truths cracking under pressure. She took one slow step forward and placed the folder, in simple, gray, unmarked, on the table like it was evidence in a criminal trial. Her voice, when it came, was low but razor sharp. Since everyone in this room seems to agree that American lives matter, let's look at how we're treating them. She opened the folder and pulled a single sheet from the top. According to the Congressional Budget Office, as of this fiscal year, 27 million Americans live without health insurance. She let the number hang, her voice a scalpel. That's not an estimate. That's not partisan. That's a verified figure. Nearly 1 in 10 people in this country with zero access to affordable medical care. Not because they're lazy, not because they're undocumented, but because they can't afford to live here. She stepped to the center of the chamber now, walking slowly, deliberately, holding up the paper like it was a mirror. And do you know what that means in real terms? She asked. It means they're gambling with their lungs, their kidneys, their hearts, because a visit to the emergency room might cost more than their monthly rent. It means that a mother finds a lump in her breast and tells herself it's nothing, because getting it checked would mean losing her job and still not affording the treatment. She pulled another page from the folder and raised her voice just slightly, not to shout, but to cut through the dull hum of rising shame. 62% of all personal bankruptcies in this country are caused by medical debt. Let me say that again for the record. Not gambling, not drugs, not reckless spending, medical debt. She looked directly at the ranking members of the committee now, her tone hardened steel. People are going bankrupt trying to survive. They are selling their homes, draining their children's college funds, maxing out credit cards, not to get rich, but to stay alive. She paused just long enough to make sure no one could escape the gravity of the numbers. And then she went in for the pivot. Not a rhetorical trick, but a dismantling of the very premise Pence had staked his defense on. And since we're talking about what's killing Americans, she said, pulling out the final sheet of data, let's address the crisis this wall is supposedly being built to stop. Fentanyl. She didn't dramatize the word. She made it surgical. 80% of fentanyl seized in this country, she said, holding the page high, is not intercepted sneaking through remote deserts or river crossings. No, it's found at legal ports of entry, at highways, at commercial freight lines, at places where we already have officers, scanners, gates. She turned back toward the screen that had shown Tyrole's final moments in Eliana's locked hospital. So ask yourself, with all your talk of securing the border, is the wall actually doing that? Or is it just a monument to our misdirection? Her voice sharpened. Because the data says it isn't stopping the drugs. The data says it isn't protecting the people. and the budget says it's swallowing the very resources that could be. She placed all three papers side by side on the desk, like tombstones. 27 million without insurance, she repeated. 62% of bankruptcies caused by trying to stay alive. And the drugs? Coming right through the front door while we pour billions into locking the side gate. She let that sink in. No more words for a moment, just silence. And in that silence, the room began to shift. Not visibly, not dramatically, but something broke. A glance downward. A shuffle of papers that no longer seemed relevant. Even the stone-faced aide stopped typing, because this wasn't a speech anymore. It was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't deliver a soundbite. She simply straightened the pages in front of her and finished the moment with a final blow wrapped in restraint. When a government builds walls faster than it builds clinics, she said softly, it isn't protecting its people. It's protecting its own conscience from having to look them in the eye. And with that, she stepped back. Not because she was done, but because the truth was. The numbers still echoed in the minds of every person in that chamber. Cold, factual indictments that stripped away rhetoric and exposed raw neglect. But Jasmine Crockett knew numbers weren't enough. Facts alone rarely pierced armor woven from ideology and self-preservation. She needed something more, something that couldn't be debated or deflected. She needed to force them to see themselves. With slow, deliberate motion, she reached beneath the open folder in front of her and withdrew a small, cloth-wrapped object. Her fingers moved methodically, unwrapping it as if revealing something sacred. A glint of silver caught the chamber's overhead lights. Gasps rippled in the back rows as members craned their necks, squinting to make sense of the polished rectangle now resting on the polished wood desk before her. It was a mirror, simple, clean, unapologetically direct. Jasmine didn't say a word at first. She just tilted it forward gently so that it caught the lights above and then slowly caught him. Mike Pence's face reflected clearly in the surface. The chamber stilled, breathless, as the symbolism began to land. First like a whisper, then like a thunderclap. She placed both hands flat on either side of the mirror and finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, but carried with the weight of a final judgment. Look into that, she said, not asking, commanding. You want to talk about security, about who's worth building walls for, about who we're defending this country against? But the face staring back at you isn't a cartel member, isn't a trafficker, isn't a shadow at the border. Her eyes locked with his, unwavering. The person you need to protect is already here. She let the words linger, like smoke coiling in still air. They come from Houston, she continued, voice tightening with emotion now. Not weakness, but steel pressed under heat. They come from Detroit, from Phoenix, from South Dallas, from Jackson, Mississippi, from the very streets that carry American flags on porches and stretchers on sidewalks, from the places where mothers are waiting 4 hours in a clinic hallway so their children can be seen for a fever. I know because my mother did the same for me. I sat there burning up while she paced with worry because there were too few doctors, too few nurses, too few resources, but plenty of excuses. The room sat motionless, eyes pinging between her and the mirror. They're not coming for our jobs, she said, her voice rising slightly. They're not climbing fences. They're already inside. They're working 2 shifts and still can't afford insulin. They're veterans rationing pills. They're children fainting in classrooms because their parents couldn't pay for an urgent care visit. They're not undocumented. They're undocumented by you, by a system that refuses to count them unless it's for a census or a headline. She stepped slightly to the side, letting the mirror take full center now, like a silent witness under oath. You built a wall to look outward, she said, but that mirror is your first wall that reflects inward. And what it's showing you, what it's showing all of us, is that the enemy isn't on the other side of a desert. It's inside these walls. It's the apathy that lets a man die on a bench outside a shuttered clinic. It's the politics that cut funding to rural hospitals but find billions for surveillance drones. It's the blindness that lets you build fortresses for a future threat while ignoring the people collapsing all around you. She turned back toward Pence now, her voice steady, controlled, but infused with quiet fire. You don't need another blueprint, Mr. Pence. You don't need another wall. You need to look at that reflection and ask yourself one question. Would you fight this hard if the people dying looked like you, lived in your neighborhood, attended your church? Her voice dropped into a whisper, but somehow grew louder in impact. Because that mirror doesn't lie. It just doesn't let you look away anymore. And then she stepped back. Not out of performance, not out of politeness, but because she had said everything she needed to say, the mirror remained silent, still, reflecting not just one man, but an entire system built on looking outward when the rot was already spreading from within. No one moved, not the staffers, not the senators, not even the cameras. It was as if the whole chamber had been turned into glass, suddenly confronted with its own reflection, unable to blink, unable to breathe, unable to deny the truth staring back at it. The mirror still sat on the table, untouched, its surface no longer just reflecting Pence's face, but echoing everything Jasmine Crockett had laid bare. For a full minute, no one moved. No rebuttals, no gavel strikes, just the heavy silence of a room that had run out of distractions. Then, breaking the tension with a controlled nod, the chairman leaned into his microphone. Given the intensity of the debate, he said carefully, this committee has authorized a real-time public consultation. We will now initiate a live vote through the Congressional Civic Response app. The results will appear on the chamber's main screen in 90 seconds. It was an unprecedented step, one that shifted the floor not back to the politicians, but to the people outside these walls, the ones who had no security escorts, no speechwriters, no microphones, but everything to lose. Screens around the room came alive with digital prompts. Which should Congress prioritize with the proposed discretionary budget? Two options pulsed on every device: expand border wall infrastructure or reinvest in public healthcare services. It was no longer a question for senators, pundits, or legacy. It was a question for the nation, and the nation was watching. For a few long seconds, the room was filled only with the quiet tapping of touchscreen responses and the low hum of anticipation from the press gallery. No one spoke. Even Pence, who moments earlier had thundered about survival, sat with his hands clasped tightly before him, eyes fixed on the floor. Jasmine remained standing, arms crossed, not triumphant, but resolute. She knew what this was. It wasn't a victory, it was a verdict. Then the lights dimmed slightly, and the screen at the front of the hearing room shifted. Bars began to rise in real time, percentages crawling upward like a live heartbeat. First in slow rhythm, then accelerating. 81%. Public health care investment. Gasps broke across the chamber like scattered applause. Audible, involuntary, disbelief and clarity merging in the same breath. 13%. Border wall expansion. And finally, in gray at the bottom, 6%. No opinion. No spin. No footnotes. Just the raw will of a nation suddenly choosing stethoscopes over steel. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply turned to the screen, allowing the numbers to fill the air where arguments had once lived. She didn't need to interpret them. They were self-evident. But the cameras did what cameras do. They searched the room for a face, a crack in the wall, and they found Pence. The lens tightened on him as he stared at the numbers, his expression neutral at first, then slowly tightening at the jaw. His lips pressed together, not in defiance but in calculation. He'd spent decades reading polls, but this wasn't a poll. This was a moment, a rupture, and he knew it, because there are arguments that collapse under facts, and then there are those that crumble under the weight of public conscience. The camera cut back to Jasmine. She met Pence's eyes, not with contempt, not with glee, but with the unwavering force of someone who had dragged the truth into daylight and watched it stand on its own. She didn't need to say another word. The entire room understood. The debate was over. The wall, so often framed as protection, had been reframed as neglect. One final number flickered on the screen, almost as an aftershock. 312,000 participants. 312,000 Americans, weighing in not as pundits, but as patients, parents, workers, and citizens. And 81% of them had chosen care over concrete. The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full of the reality that something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the bloodstream of the country watching. The hearing was still technically in session, but no one cared. No closing statements would change what had just happened, and no wall would ever feel the same again. The numbers still glowed on the screen above the chamber, hard, fixed, and now irrefutable. 81% for public health care, 13% for expanding the border wall, and 6% undecided. There was no applause yet, no celebration, just a dense, trembling silence hanging in the air like the moment before a dam breaks. Jasmine Crockett stood still at her desk, one hand resting lightly on the manila folder, the other beside the mirror she had placed earlier, like a quiet indictment. The reflection within it, simple and inescapable, had captured more than one face. It had captured the moment the argument ended and the reckoning began. The chairman didn't speak. No one did. For all their years in this building, for all the debates and votes and choreographed sound bites, this was not how these hearings usually concluded, and yet something about it felt inevitable. Jasmine knew that if she sat down now, the room would remain stuck in its own breathless suspension. Not because of what had been won, but because of what had been exposed. No policy had passed, no amendment ratified, but the truth had arrived. Undeniable, unrelenting. She stepped forward again. No script, no theatrics. Just a woman standing alone beneath the Great Seal of the United States, her voice clear, slow, and devastating. "I want to leave this chamber with a question," she said, the words low but slicing through the room like wire through silk. Not a bill, not a headline, not a slogan or a soundbite. A question. She paused, letting the weight of her silence build tension. Not as a tactic, but as a consequence. "We've talked about numbers today," she continued, eyes scanning the committee dais. "We've talked about billions for concrete and razor wire. We've talked about fentanyl and fear and foreign threats. We've debated borders and security and sovereignty." She took another step, the sound of her heel echoing across the marble. "But we haven't talked about us. Not really. About what it means to call ourselves a nation when millions within that nation are invisible. When the richest country on earth is somehow the one where the poor die silently in waiting rooms, or in parking lots, or on cold benches outside shuttered clinics." Her voice sharpened now, not louder but heavier, like a blade turned flat and pressed slowly against the skin. "You say a wall keeps us safe. I say a wall is what we build when we no longer know how to care. You say it protects us. I say it divides us. Not just from the world, but from our reflection." She gestured to the mirror again, its polished surface still angled toward Pence, toward the cameras, toward all those watching at home. "That mirror doesn't show an enemy. It doesn't show a threat. It shows the people you've overlooked, the ones you said you were defending, but never heard, the ones who weren't foreign invaders, but your own citizens, your own neighbors, your own people, asking only to be seen." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. Not data, not budget lines, but a photo. A child in a hospital gown, no more than 5 years old, clutching a teddy bear as oxygen tubes snaked beneath her nose. "This is Mia," she said, voice tightening. "She died waiting for a heart transplant. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Her insurance had lapsed by 10 days. That's all it took. 10 days. And a system more interested in checking forms than checking pulses." She turned the photo around so the committee could see. There was no border between Mia and safety, just a wall made of paper and policy. She placed the photo beside the mirror, letting the 2 symbols sit there in silence. "I have 1 sentence left," she said softly. And then she looked at Pence, not with contempt, not with victory, but with something far more dangerous to the architecture of indifference: clarity. If a child is dying and we still choose to build a wall, then what we need in this country is not fencing. What we need is a conscience. For 1 full second, there was nothing. No movement, no response. Just silence, thick and staggering. Then from the gallery above, a single person stood. They clapped once, then again, and the chamber followed. row by row, slowly rising from their seats, filling the room not with ceremony, but release. Staffers stood, journalists rose, even a few senators, reluctantly at first, then in quiet acknowledgement. The sound swelled, not like a cheer, but like a wave crashing against something ancient and hollow. Jasmine didn't move. She let it happen around her, never breaking the line of sight with the mirror in front of her. Because the applause wasn't for her. It was for the truth she had spoken aloud. The truth that had, for a moment, filled the room more completely than any budget ever could. And then the room fell still again. Not with fatigue, with reckoning. Jasmine stepped back once, then twice, allowing space for the silence to speak for itself. The mirror gleamed, the photo lay still, and the screen behind her, now dimmed, was no longer displaying numbers. Just the great seal of the United States, now oddly fragile beneath the weight of what had just been said. She turned back to the panel one last time. Her final words came not like a conclusion, but like the first tremor of a shift beneath the surface. We keep telling ourselves we're afraid of outsiders, but maybe what we're really afraid of is the truth about ourselves. It hit like a silent explosion, a line so quietly delivered, it felt as though the air itself had cracked open. No gavel struck. No one declared adjournment. The hearing, technically, was still in session, but everyone knew it was already over. Not because Jasmine had ended it, but because truth had. The chairman didn't speak. Pence didn't move. The cameras were still rolling, but there was nothing left to capture. Just one woman standing beneath the flag, beside a mirror, beside a photo of a child, in a room that no longer felt like it could lie to itself, at least not today. And far beyond the hearing, across kitchen tables and hospital break rooms, into phones and living rooms across the country, the question moved like wildfire. Are we protecting our borders, or just building walls to keep from seeing what we become? The mirror still sat on the table, untouched. The chamber was silent, not because the conversation was over, but because something deeper had cracked open and now refused to close. Jasmine Crockett stood at the eye of the storm she had summoned. Not with thunder, not with applause, but with a stillness more powerful than any outburst. And yet she knew, truth alone doesn't change a nation. Truth only starts the fire. To make it spread, she would have to light the match one more time. She stepped forward. Not for show, not to punctuate what had already been said, but because unfinished justice has a sound, and she was going to give it a voice. Her tone was quieter now, but sharper, more urgent, like glass underfoot. "Let me speak not to this chamber," she began, scanning the polished wood and the unmoved expressions of political ritual, "but to the people watching at home, not to the senators seated here, but to the ones in scrubs, behind steering wheels, holding second jobs, holding dying hands, to the people who don't have a seat in this room, but feel the decisions made here like they're pressing down on their chests." The silence shifted, deeper now, not out of tension, but out of gravity. She leaned slightly on the table, palms open. "You've been told you're powerless, that your pain is just an unfortunate side effect of complex policy, that your struggle isn't a crisis, just a calculation, that your child's missed vaccine, your mother's closed clinic, your father's unpaid hospital bill are sad stories, but not urgent. And you've been told that the only thing you can do is wait. Wait for the next vote. Wait for the next budget. Wait for them to remember you exist." Her voice rose now, not in volume, but in moral altitude. "But I need you to hear me. You do not have to wait another minute. You do not have to wait for permission to matter. You do not have to wait to fight for someone whose name will never appear in a press release." She stepped around the table, the mirror and the photo still beside her like sacred symbols. If your child is uninsured, make that their problem. Call their offices, show up at their fundraisers. Ask them why they paid for a drone but not for your inhaler. Ask them why they held a press conference about the border wall while your neighbor died in silence 3 blocks from the nearest clinic. She turned her body toward the camera. The invisible thousands, perhaps millions, watching through phones, televisions, streaming feeds. Don't let them tell you this issue is too complicated. You live the consequences. You know it's simple. People are dying, not from invasion, but from abandonment. And abandonment is a policy choice. Her eyes burned now, but not from rage, from clarity. Start where you are. If your child's school is running a food drive because too many students come to class hungry, speak up. If your local clinic shuts its doors 3 hours early because it's out of funding, don't just post about it. Write your mayor, write your governor, write your representative. Show up at their town halls with photos, not pleasantries. She stopped, let her breath sit in the room for a beat, then pressed on with more force. They're counting on your exhaustion. They're counting on your cynicism. They want you to believe that nothing can change, because that is how they keep everything the same. Her voice cracked, just slightly, but it made the words land harder. But every clinic reopened, every child vaccinated, every policy rewritten to include people like you, starts with one action they didn't see coming. She stepped forward, pointed directly to the screen above the committee's dais, the one that had earlier displayed the live vote. You already spoke once? 81%. You chose care over concrete. You chose life over fear. Don't stop now. Make that number echo beyond this hearing. She walked again, not pacing, but moving like someone preparing to launch something heavier than words. You may not have a PAC. You may not have a platform. You may not get invited to Capitol Hill. She paused. But you have a voice. You have a vote. You have a story. And that is enough to terrify them into action. Now her tone deepened, like thunder rolling low in a summer sky. Flood their offices, melt their inboxes, show up in numbers they can't ignore. Show up even when they try to push you to the back. Show up until their donors ask, who are these people and why aren't they going away? Show up until their pollsters whisper, if we don't address this, we lose. Her breath slowed again. She looked around the chamber, gaze calm but unrelenting. You don't win this fight with hashtags. You win it with disruption, with uncomfortable questions in quiet halls, with persistence in the face of polite deflection. You win it the way justice has always been won, by people who had no choice but to make themselves heard. And then she looked into the camera one last time, eyes steady, shoulders squared, not asking, not inviting, challenging. If you've ever sat in an ER wondering how long your child could hold on, if you've ever skipped a dose to make it to payday, if you've ever buried someone who should have lived because care came too late or not at all, then don't wait another day. She turned toward the committee again, letting her final words fall across both marble and memory. Don't just hope someone else will act. Be the interruption. Be the voice they didn't budget for. Be the vote they didn't see coming. Be the wall that justice climbs over, and the door that decency walks through. The silence that followed wasn't silence anymore. It was movement, not yet visible, but alive. A fire that had been lit not on a podium, but in kitchens, in crowded buses, in hospital corridors, in every place where injustice had been endured without recognition, until now. And somewhere, far beyond that hearing room, a mother picked up the phone. A father opened his inbox. A teacher printed flyers. A nurse walked out of her night shift and told her story to a local reporter. Not because someone had handed them permission, but because someone had reminded them of their power. Because Crockett hadn't just testified. She had called for reinforcements. And this time, the country was listening. The chamber still hummed with the residue of Jasmine's final declaration, but she wasn't done. Truth left untouched becomes ceremony, and today was no ceremony, it was confrontation. She stepped forward again, not for applause, not for comfort, but for combustion. Her voice, steady and razor-edged, came not as a plea but as a reckoning. Let me speak directly to those beyond these walls, the Americans who watch this hearing with clenched jaws and quiet rage. They're counting on you to move on. They think by tomorrow you'll be drowned in bills, distractions, exhaustion. But if you saw what I saw today, if you felt it, then this isn't the end. It's ignition. She took one step closer to the cameras, not invading, but inviting. Her voice was lower now, the kind of quiet that makes people lean in. You've been told your voice doesn't count, that your pain is inconvenient, That your kids missed surgery, your spouse's unpaid treatment, your own breathlessness waiting in a lobby too full to help, aren't crises, just data, just background noise. But let me say this with no ambiguity. You are not background. You are not marginal. You are the front line of every failed decision they signed with a smile. Her hands were open now, not in surrender, but in defiance, the gesture of someone offering not comfort, but command. This fight isn't waiting for permission, and neither should you. She turned, scanning the marble faces of lawmakers seated in expensive suits and practiced neutrality. Start where you are. Pick up the phone. Flood their lines until the voicemail system crashes. Show up at their town halls with stories, not slogans. Tell them the name of your child, the name of your pharmacist, the name of the nurse who cried beside you because the equipment you needed didn't arrive on time. She breathed once, not to pause but to center the flame. Turn their safe offices into confessionals. Make them look you in the eye and explain why the wall was worth more than your life. She pointed toward the screen where earlier the mirror had glinted under Capitol lights. Look again. The threat isn't coming from another country. It's coming from the policies that let hospitals close in your zip code, from the budgets that treated children's lungs as optional, from the silence that greets every death too poor to trend online. Her tone sharpened, voice like a match dragged across a national fuse. So let's talk about action, not hope. Action? You vote, yes, but you also speak. You organize, you write, you rally. You make sure your story is no longer background noise. It becomes the sound that shakes windows in places they thought were insulated. And when they tell you you're being too emotional, remind them, a child's last breath isn't polite. A parent choosing between chemo and rent isn't quiet. So neither are we. She leaned into the podium now, as if she were laying bricks made of rage and righteousness. You've already seen the numbers. You've seen the mirror. Now be the answer. Text 5 friends, email 10, post what happened here today, show them the image. Ask them, what do we do now? And don't stop until the answer comes with legislation, with funding, with actual healing. Not bandages, healing. Her voice turned again, deeper, softer, deadly clear. Don't let them shame you into silence. Shame is their last defense. It's what they use when they run out of logic. When they fear what happens if you stop whispering and start shouting. They are not afraid of your facts. They are afraid of your follow-through. So give them something to be afraid of. She raised her hand, pointing at no one and everyone. I want town halls filled. I want inboxes flooded. I want rallies in cities, in suburbs, in the corners of the country they thought had already given up. Show up at campaign stops, at church meetings, at school board elections. Ask them why your tax dollars built steel, but couldn't buy your inhaler. Ask them why fentanyl is blamed on the border. When they know it's walked in through legal ports, they refuse to regulate. Jasmine's breathing was slow now, not because she was tired, but because the room was. The audience had gone from still to stirred. She didn't have to shout. The weight did the work. If you've ever held a child's hand and wondered if they'd survive the night, if you've skipped a dose so your parent could take theirs, if you've stood over a grave and wondered if one more appointment could have saved them, then this is your line in the sand. She pointed once more to the polished floor beneath her heels. This marble was laid by people who never got thanked, who never got care, who never got seen. We walk on their sacrifices. Don't let this moment end in echoes. Let it end in action. She stepped away from the mic and walked to the center of the chamber, facing the camera head on, one final time. No wall will save us from what we refuse to fix inside our own borders. No wall will shield us from the truth about who we failed. But you can be the wall that justice climbs over, the voice that pierces every excuse, the breath that revives this nation's conscience. Then she dropped her hand, as if lowering the gavel the chairman never would. Interrupt them. A pause. Interrupt everything. And just like that, the room was no longer just a place where power spoke. It was a place where power shifted, where watching wasn't enough, where Jasmine Crockett didn't just end a hearing, she began a movement. and every viewer who heard her last line would have to choose walk away or walk in. The hearing adjourned, but no one stood. The gavel fell, but it sounded more like an afterthought, a punctuation mark lost in the storm Jasmine had unleashed. Even Pence didn't move. His jaw clenched, eyes locked on the chamber floor, as if searching for an argument that had drowned somewhere between the mirror and the screen. Cameras zoomed out. The chairman shuffled his papers, but it felt mechanical, empty. Jasmine had not just spoken. She had detonated something, and now that fire was spilling past marble columns and velvet ropes. Outside the Capitol, a ripple began. Phones lit up across the country, notifications stacking like bricks in a wall Jasmine had commanded to fall. The hashtags were already trending. Wall of conscience, interrupt everything, not one more child. In Memphis, a nurse forwarded the clip to her union. In Tucson, a father showed it to his teenage son, his eyes welling as he whispered, "This is why I vote." In Akron, a college student stood up in a silent dorm lounge and said, "We should organize." The footage spread like lightning, not because it was loud, but because it was true. There was no viral gimmick, no shock joke clip. Just a woman in a Congress seat holding the nation's mirror and refusing to let anyone look away. By nightfall, a coalition of grassroots clinics across 5 states had launched a coordinated campaign titled, "Be the Flood." Their demand? Divert emergency funds from DHS's concrete contracts to pediatric ICU staffing. Meanwhile, political operatives scrambled behind closed doors. Polling firms were called at midnight. "Run that clip. What are we seeing in swing counties?" Governors issued prepared statements that read like damp paper. All caution, no courage. But it didn't matter. Jasmine hadn't spoken for headlines. She had spoken for a movement, and it wasn't waiting for permission anymore. In Houston, a mother printed her medical bill, $17,962 for her daughter's untreated seizure. She taped it to her front door. In Chicago, a pastor rewrote Sunday's sermon around Jasmine's closing line, "Interrupt everything." In West Virginia, a group of retired coal miners, each with worn hands and state insurance that barely covered prescriptions, called their local representative's office, not to ask, to demand. And far above it all, the Capitol dome stood silent, a relic of battles past, now witnessing the start of one not yet written in any law book, but etched in the pulse of the people rising below. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Bernie Sanders collide in a fierce congressional hearing over one burning crisis: how to stop America's income inequality, where billionaires grow richer while everyday families are crushed by unfair taxes. Bernie warns against moving too fast, urging caution and consensus. But Jasmine strikes back with blistering precision, dismantling not just Bernie's slow and steady strategy, but the very foundation of his philosophy. Their visions couldn't be more different, one rooted in caution, the other in confrontation. As tensions rise and the chamber holds its breath, one question crackles through the silence. When two justice warriors collide, who will lead the fight for America's economic soul? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The U.S. Capitol was charged with tension as the hearing began. This session focused on a crucial issue: how to combat income inequality and tax the rich. The room, filled with lawmakers and experts, was about to discuss the growing divide between the wealthy and the rest of America. Among those leading the discussion were Jasmine Crockett and Bernie Sanders. Jasmine, a dynamic and passionate lawmaker, was known for her fierce stance on social justice. She had long fought for the rights of marginalized communities and wasn't afraid to challenge the unfair systems in place. With urgency in her voice, she called for immediate, bold action to address the systemic inequality. On the other side, Bernie Sanders, the seasoned senator, championed progressive tax reform and had been advocating for taxing the rich for decades. However, his approach was more cautious, focused on gradual, long-term solutions. His belief was that change had to be built slowly, through broad political consensus. Despite their shared goal of reducing inequality, Jasmine and Bernie clashed over their methods. Jasmine demanded swift, radical change, while Bernie urged a more measured, strategic approach. Their differences set the stage for a heated debate on how to solve America's wealth gap. The air in the chamber had barely settled when Bernie Sanders adjusted his microphone and rose slowly to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers would do it for him. "Let's begin with what the Federal Reserve has confirmed," he said, holding up a printed report like a piece of damning evidence. 1% of Americans now control 40% of the wealth in this country. He turned, eyes scanning the room. Meanwhile, the bottom 50%, the half of this nation working the hardest, struggling the most, own just 2%. He let the silence stretch, heavy and accusatory. "This isn't a wealth gap," he said grimly. "It's an economic chasm designed to keep people down while a handful rise." Bernie took a breath, his voice tightening with conviction. "This is why I've called, again, for a serious increase in taxes on the ultra-rich and the corporations hoarding billions while millions suffer," he continued, tapping the edge of his prepared notes. "Not symbolic reform, real taxation, the kind that funds healthcare, housing, and human dignity." He held up a folder labeled Medicare for All, his signature proposal. "We tax wealth so we can protect life. If you can afford a yacht, you can afford to help a child get insulin. If your company posts $10 billion in profits, you can afford to help pay for universal health care. Then quieter but deadlier, if we don't act now, then we are no longer representatives of the people. We are accomplices to their suffering." Bernie's final words still echoed through the chamber when Jasmine Crockett rose. Not in opposition, but in escalation, her expression carved with urgency, as if truth itself were demanding more than careful compromise. She walked to the center of the room with measured defiance, the faint tap of her heels the only sound as every eye turned. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium, not for support, but to brace the weight of what she was about to unleash. "Senator Sanders is absolutely right," she began, voice steady, not soft. "This nation is drowning in inequality. But if we keep reaching for the same tools, the same incremental fixes, we're just rearranging furniture on a house that's already on fire." She paused, then lifted a printed chart from her binder, holding it high. "This is from Oxfam, 2020. While hundreds of millions were losing jobs, homes, and dignity during the pandemic, two men, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, increased their wealth by over $300 billion combined." Her eyes scanned the stunned committee, and at the same time, over 700 million people fell deeper into poverty. Globally, that is not imbalance. That is plunder. Her voice sharpened. "This isn't just about taxes. This is about a structure that rewards exploitation at every level. We talk about raising rates on income, but billionaires don't live on income. They live on power, multiplied through loopholes, trusts, shell companies, and stock inflation." She pointed to another chart, one showing asset growth over wages. "You raise the tax rate, they move assets. You close one door, they buy the building." Her tone was no longer a warning, it was an indictment. We cannot pretend that we're fixing injustice by polishing the surface. What Senator Sanders proposes is a start, but we are long past starting. The system is designed to regenerate inequality faster than we can regulate it. And if we are serious about justice, we can't just charge the players, we have to change the game. Her voice fell silent, but the tension she left in its place said everything else. But Jasmine wasn't finished, because behind every billionaire's fortune wasn't just a pile of money, but a labyrinth of protection built by policy, bought by influence, and enforced by silence. And today she would break that silence. D again. The next slide showed an IRS tax summary from 2021, her own annotations marked in red. "The numbers are not secret, they are public, and they are damning." Her hand lifted the IRS compliance report high above her head like an indictment in court. "This document," she said, walking slowly across the floor, "proves that the richest Americans and their corporations are not avoiding taxes by accident. They are avoiding taxes by design." She flipped through highlighted passages. deferred income, stock-based compensation, shell companies in Delaware, invisible subsidiaries in Bermuda, and my personal favorite, charitable foundations that funnel money right back to their own families while still collecting deductions. Her voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in emotional temperature. And every bit of it is legal, not moral, not fair, just legal enough to escape consequence. She turned to the audience, locking eyes with one representative after another. And who wrote those laws? She asked, her voice narrowing. Not working families, not small business owners. No, these rules were written in rooms far from this chamber, by lobbyists for billionaires, passed by people who accepted their checks. A brief silence fell, sharp as a blade. She pressed forward. A cashier making $28,000 a year pays more in taxes, in percentage terms, than Amazon. She doesn't get a deduction for writing off her groceries. She doesn't get to delay her income into a lower bracket. And she damn sure doesn't have a lawyer calling the IRS on her behalf. She pointed to the screen again. But Amazon does, and that's the difference. That's the betrayal. The lights in the room seemed harsher now. Her words had stripped the niceties away from the discussion. There was no more theory, no more abstraction, just reality laid bare. This isn't about whether we tax the rich, she said, slowing her tone. It's about whether we're willing to admit that the rich have already rigged the game, and we, the so-called representatives of the people, have watched it happen. Some of us, she glanced toward a few silent faces in suits, have helped it happen. A final click brought up her last slide, one that made the room visibly shift in their seats. It was a side-by-side comparison. A single mother earning minimum wage, paying 18.5% in combined federal and payroll taxes. Next to it, a tech billionaire who paid 3.2% on millions in net wealth increases thanks to capital gains deferral and offshore assets. These aren't just numbers, Jasmine said, her voice cracking like a dry branch. They are policy choices, and every time we choose to defend loopholes, to stall reform, to protect these job creators, we are making another choice too, to leave working Americans behind. Then with perfect timing, she fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The chamber didn't breathe. That's when Bernie Sanders rose. His hands rested calmly on the table, but his shoulders carried the weight of decades in this fight. Congresswoman Crockett is right, he said, with a nod that wasn't just respectful. It was honest. What we are witnessing is not just tax avoidance, it is economic apartheid. He turned to the same chart Jasmine had shown and tapped it once with a forefinger that trembled, not from fear, but from age and fury. If a democracy allows the wealthiest to escape the obligations of citizenship, then it is no longer a democracy. It is a playground for oligarchs. He lifted a single sheet of paper, simple, clean, direct. That is why I propose a progressive tax code, not a band-aid, not a gesture, a structure. His finger moved down the margin. 10% on the bottom bracket, 25% on the middle, 40%, 50%, even 70% on extreme wealth. He looked up. Because if you earn billions while Americans sleep in their cars, your success has a price. The room stirred, but Bernie pressed forward. This is not punishment. This is fairness. This is ensuring that the janitor and the billionaire do not live in different nations under the same flag. His voice grew steadier as he framed his call. And with that revenue, he said, lifting the paper again, we fund Medicare for all. We eliminate premiums. We cancel medical bankruptcies. We close the door on profit in human suffering. He nodded toward Jasmine with something close to solemn reverence. Because she's right. People are tired of bandages on bullet wounds. It's time we stitch the whole thing up. The room felt smaller now, the distance between outrage and action closing inch by inch. Still standing, Bernie laid his final thought like a stone on the table. Let this hearing mark the moment we stopped apologizing for asking the rich to pay what they owe, and started building a country where working people can breathe again. The silence that followed wasn't from fear, it was from recognition. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. The chamber was still vibrating with tension when Jasmine stepped forward again. not to reject Bernie's framework, but to tear the floorboards out from under it and expose what lay beneath. A system that taxed earnings while letting empires go untouched. Jasmine's expression had hardened into something colder, sharper. Not fury, focus. She turned her back to the committee for a moment, facing the towering digital screen as it displayed a familiar phrase, progressive income taxation. Then she turned around slowly, her voice slicing through the silence like the blade of a scalpel. We've spent decades pretending that taxing income is the same as taxing power, she began, her tone deliberate and devastating. It's not, because real power in America doesn't come from wages. It comes from what you own. She pointed to the screen, which now shifted to a chart from the Economic Policy Institute, EPI. This is the part of the story we never talk about. While income inequality has grown steadily, wealth inequality has exploded. And we're still chasing pay stubs while the billionaires hide their kingdoms in plain sight. She stepped forward, clicking the remote again. The screen displayed two columns, one labeled annual income, the other total net worth. In one row, a software engineer earning $160,000 a year with a modest home and savings. In the other, a hedge fund owner claiming only $600,000 in income, while sitting atop $900 million in assets. We could raise income taxes to the ceiling, Jasmine said, raising her voice slightly, and he would still walk away untouched. Why? Because we're taxing the wrong thing. We're looking at the fruit while ignoring the roots. The chamber had grown still again. Eyes drifted toward Bernie. Jasmine wasn't attacking him. She was demanding evolution. She lifted a thick binder labeled EPI 2022, Wealth Concentration Report, and flipped to a bookmark section. Her voice dropped an octave. According to this data, the top 0.1% of households in this country own as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. She raised her eyes. Let me say that again. The top 0.1%, roughly 160,000 households, own more than 290 million Americans put together. The number landed like a blow. Jasmine didn't flinch. So tell me, what good is an income tax when the real danger is not how much they earn, but how much they already own? She let the question hang, unanswered and undeniable. She clicked again. The image on screen changed to a map of Europe, with one country highlighted in bold blue, France. In 2017, France implemented what they called the Impôt de solidarité sur la fortune, a tax on personal net worth above 1.3 million euros, she said. It wasn't perfect, it was controversial, but it did something we've been too afraid to do. It forced the richest households to put something back into the society that made them rich. She turned toward the room, her voice hardening. This wasn't just about fairness. It was about survival, about pulling money off the sidelines and injecting it back into healthcare, education, and infrastructure. About clawing back opportunity from the vaults where it's been buried for generations. Her pace slowed, each step purposeful. That's what I'm proposing now, she said. A federal net wealth tax, not just a one-time surcharge, a permanent, tiered structure applied to fortunes above $50 million, tax shelters closed, assets audited, trust loopholes neutralized. She held up a page from her proposed legislation, bolded and annotated. If we fail to do this, if we keep pretending income is the only metric of economic justice, then we're chasing shadows while the real power consolidates in silence. She paused. What we need is not just a better tax code, we need a different lens. One that sees how power hides itself in property, in portfolios, in perpetual inheritance. The air had grown thicker now, not from heat but from pressure, the kind that builds before something breaks. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing just enough to sting. The truth is this, she said slowly. We've made taxation about productivity, about punishing people for working. But the system doesn't reward work. It rewards ownership. It rewards hoarding. It rewards those who make money by sitting still while others sweat. She glanced toward the camera, aware that millions were likely watching. And until we stop calling that prosperity and start calling it extraction, nothing will change. She stepped to the side of the podium, hands gripping both edges as if anchoring herself to the moment. Bernie's plan, Raising income tax is a foundation, but without a wealth tax, it's a dam with cracks. Every billionaire will keep slipping through. Every dynasty will keep buying silence. And every struggling American will keep wondering why their hard work never turns into freedom. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it was the most dangerous sound in the room. If we're not willing to tax what they hide, we're not taxing power. We're just taxing paychecks. With that, Jasmine didn't yield the floor. She stood silent, allowing her words to settle like dust after demolition. And in that quiet, the committee sat frozen, not out of disagreement, but because everything they'd built their arguments on had just been moved 2 inches off the ground. And they weren't sure yet where it would land. The chamber was still pulsing from Jasmine's thunderous call for a wealth tax. But amid the tremors, Bernie Sanders stepped forward, not to extinguish the fire, but to steady the flame before it consumed everything. Bernie's hands rested on the table, fingers splayed, eyes fixed on the center of the room like a soldier recalling a battlefield. His voice, when it came, didn't rise. It tightened, like the tension in a drawn bow. "What Congresswoman Crockett demands," he began, "is not wrong. It is righteous. But we must not mistake the sound of moral clarity for the absence of political landmines." The screen behind him flickered to a photo. President Obama signing the Affordable Care Act, flanked by cheers, hope, and cameras. Bernie turned to it, jaw clenched with memory. "I was there. I saw what happened the moment we tried to deliver even a sliver of fairness to working people." His hand motioned through the air like cutting through smoke. "Within hours, corporate lobbies mobilized with one mission: to destroy what we had built." He stepped forward, slower than Jasmine had, but no less determined. "You don't need to imagine how they'll react to a wealth tax," he said, his voice now layered with tension. "Just remember how they reacted to basic health care. Millions of dollars flooded into PACs overnight. Lies spread like wildfire. Death panels, they said. Government takeovers. They didn't just attack the policy, they attacked the idea of public good." His words hit like cold wind in a burning room. And they chipped it away. One repeal here, one legal challenge there, one budget cut at a time, until what we had left was a patchwork stitched together by executive orders and hope. He turned, locking eyes with Jasmine, not with resistance, but with gravity. "So yes," he said, "we must act. But we must act knowing the machine we're facing, because they're already preparing to destroy your bill before the ink is dry." He pointed up, toward the viewing gallery where corporate lobbyists sat in polished suits, silent, unreadable. "These men, they don't blink at a wealth tax. They buy time. They fund think tanks. They twist public opinion like a lever until justice looks like chaos." Bernie's voice dropped to a growl. "And the moment we overreach without an airtight coalition behind us, they'll paint us not as reformers, but as radicals threatening the order." His hand tightened into a fist on the lectern, not out of anger, but out of the weight of what he'd carried for decades. "We cannot afford another Obamacare moment," he said. "We cannot build a bold new policy only to watch it be torn apart in back rooms and courtrooms by those who never believe people deserve better." He looked back to the rest of the committee now. "What Jasmine proposes will face opposition that is ruthless, well-funded, and relentless. They will not stop. They will not sleep. And unless we are 10 steps ahead, with a wall of public will behind us, they will win. Again." And then, with the quiet force of someone who had lived the cost of idealism, he ended. "It's not enough to throw the first punch, no matter how righteous it feels. We must be strong enough to stand when they hit back." Bernie's words, grounded in the scars of political defeat, still lingered like smoke in the chamber. But Jasmine stepped back into the center of that storm, not to dismiss his experience, but to confront the paralysis it threatened to cause. Jasmine's voice returned with the clarity of someone who had heard too many reasons to wait. "I understand your warning, Senator," she said, steady but relentless. "But history doesn't remember the people who feared resistance. It remembers the people who forced it to reveal itself." She stepped forward again, her every movement charged with urgency. "We don't get to say not yet when people are rationing insulin, when families are working 3 jobs and still sleeping in their cars, when the wealthiest companies in this nation are sucking public money dry and giving nothing back." Her tone didn't waver. It struck harder with each word. You want a case study in the cost of restraint? Let's talk about Boeing. She raised her hand and the screen behind her flared to life. An image of the Boeing logo beside a breakdown of federal tax subsidies. Her voice hardened. Over the past decade, Boeing has received more than $60 billion in federal contracts and tax breaks. $60 billion. And yet, what did they do with that public generosity? She clicked to the next slide. Mass layoffs, wage suppression reports, and a line chart of executive compensation rising like a missile launch. They cut thousands of workers. They froze salaries. They outsourced manufacturing to chase cheaper labor while pocketing taxpayer money meant to support American jobs. Her hand dropped to her side, clenched into a fist. And the man who presided over all of it, he left with a $62 million exit package. Her eyes swept the chamber now, not with outrage, but with icy precision. We keep saying we're afraid of retaliation if we go too far. But let me ask you, what do you think they've been doing to working people this whole time? She paused, letting the weight of the question settle in. Boeing didn't retaliate after reform. They retaliated in the absence of it. They exploited the system not because we pushed them, but because we didn't. She turned back to Bernie, this time with a voice carved from steel. You say they'll push back harder if we go bold. I say they already are, and we're still standing here, afraid to move. Jasmine stepped forward once more, her final tone low, unshaking, and surgical. If fear of opposition dictates the scale of our ambition, then the people who suffer don't just lose progress, they lose representation. Her hand hovered over the Boeing slide, then closed the file altogether. We do not serve the public by waiting for the right moment. We serve them by creating it, even if the cost is conflict. Because if the price of peace is silence, then we are already complicit in the theft we claim to condemn. And in the silence that followed, it was no longer just a question of strategy. It was a test of courage. As the echoes of Jasmine's fury over Boeing's subsidized greed faded into the hushed marble stillness of the chamber, she didn't pause, didn't breathe. Instead, she reached for a truth far darker, far deeper, and far more damning. A truth inked not in policy, but in evasion, loopholes, and smoke. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless at the podium, her fingers resting on a folder so thin it looked harmless, until she lifted it. The front read one phrase in bold block type, the Paradise Papers. Her voice came low, deliberate. We've talked about the unfairness of wealth distribution. We've talked about the obscene profits and shrinking wages. But now we're going to talk about what happens behind the curtain, because this, right here, is where justice goes to die. She opened the folder slowly, revealing printouts of leaked documents, internal memos, and tax haven schematics. These are not rumors. These are not anonymous blog posts. These are contracts, filings, offshore holdings, signed, sealed, and exposed. She tapped the screen behind her, and a line appeared. Simple, brutal. 1% of Americans now control 40% of the nation's wealth. The bottom half, just 2%. This isn't a byproduct of a free market, Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the tension. It's the result of tax policies engineered to look neutral, but designed to protect the fortress of generational wealth. And inside these papers, these leaked Paradise Papers, we see the blueprints. The screen flashed again, showing a graphic map of Bermuda, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, connected to the logos of Apple, Nike, and other giants. Jasmine didn't blink. These companies didn't just use tax havens. They built empires on them. Her fingers turned a page in the folder. Apple created a stateless shell company. No headquarters, no employees, no country of tax jurisdiction. It funneled $252 billion in profit through that structure. That's $250 billion hidden in plain sight. She clicked again. Nike developed a tax structure called Nike European Operations Netherlands BV, designed to shift revenues earned from sneakers made in Asia and sold in the U.S. through a Dutch subsidiary and on to Bermuda, where tax rates hit zero. And they did it with a smile, while their PR departments told the world they were investing in communities. Her voice trembled, not from uncertainty, but from fury so sharp it could shatter glass. Then came the moment that made the room hold its collective breath. Jasmine pulled out a printed internal memo, clearly marked as confidential. This document, she said, raising it into view, was obtained from the leaked papers. It outlines how executives strategized to exploit Ireland's double taxation loopholes, explicitly stating, "Our goal is to eliminate all visible tax liability within the U.S. over the next fiscal decade." A murmur stirred across the benches. One congressman dropped his pen. Jasmine didn't break focus. "That's not ambition, that's legalized theft. And we call it strategy because the people who suffer don't sit on boards or own islands." She stepped back from the screen, her presence commanding the oxygen from the room. "Let's call this what it is," she said. "A schoolteacher in rural Georgia pays 22% of her modest salary in federal income taxes. A grocery clerk in Phoenix pays more than Amazon, more than Facebook, more than a multinational hiding $10 billion in the Cayman Islands." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of the reality. "And yet, every time we propose closing these loopholes, we're told it's too radical, too fast, too political." Well, let me ask, how political is it to let a rigged system hollow out our economy while children sit in schools without textbooks and veterans sleep in their cars? Jasmine closed the folder with a sharp snap. This system doesn't need tweaking, it needs a reckoning. She turned to the committee, her stare unwavering. "We cannot talk about income inequality without confronting how the wealth was shielded, not just through broken laws, but through laws that were designed to break us." She pointed to the final slide, which showed a side-by-side image. A single mother with a W-2 tax form next to a billionaire's offshore trust documents. "Guess who the IRS audits more often?" she said. "It's not the man with the yacht. It's the mother with the child tax credit." Her voice dropped into a fierce whisper. "This is not a glitch. It's the core code of a system that punishes transparency and rewards secrecy." For a moment, no one moved. No one even shifted in their chairs. The documents on the screen were still visible, glowing like embers of truth too dangerous to ignore. Jasmine turned her gaze outward now, not to Bernie, not to the chairperson, but to the public, to the cameras, to the people beyond those walls. "They told us it was too complex to understand," she said. "They told us the system was too big to fight. But it's not complexity they fear. It's clarity. Because once the people see, they won't unsee. And once they understand, they will demand justice. Not later, but now." And with that, she stepped back, never raising her voice, but somehow shaking the foundations beneath them all. The chamber was still ringing from the exposure Jasmine had unleashed, but into that storm of outrage stepped a voice older than battle, not to douse the fire, but to remind everyone just how far the flames had to travel to burn through stone. Bernie Sanders adjusted his microphone with the slow precision of a man who had lived through too many betrayals to believe change came without cost. His eyes, shaded beneath heavy brows, swept across the room, landing not just on lawmakers, but on the invisible machinery behind them, the billionaires, the lobbies, the corporate media whispering behind every policy. "I want to be very clear," he said, his gravelly voice rising not with passion, but with historical weight. "I do not dispute the injustice Congresswoman Crockett has laid bare. What I question is whether this country, this government, will ever let it be corrected without a war of attrition." He reached into his own folder, this one worn from age, and pulled out a sepia-toned newspaper clipping from 1935. "When President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the Wealth Tax Act, you would have thought he'd declared war on Wall Street." He held the page up. "FDR is a threat to free enterprise," screamed the headline. "The richest families in America, the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, organized against him. They accused him of class warfare, of trying to destroy America from within. Some even attempted to fund a military coup to overthrow the presidency and install a puppet regime loyal to corporate interests." His voice lowered, steady. "That's not conspiracy. That's on record. Read the McCormack-Dickstein Committee findings." The room tightened. Jasmine stood still, her eyes narrowed, but respectful. Bernie went on. "The backlash didn't stop with headlines. Lobbyists poured into D.C., weaponizing every newspaper, every radio station. The tax codes were watered down, loopholes were slipped in, and even the reforms that passed were fought tooth and nail for decades. FDR may have won the battle, but only because he had a Great Depression at his back and a world war ahead of him. That is what it took to get modest fairness from a system that has always been built to protect power. He leaned forward. So when I say we should proceed strategically with caution, it's not out of fear. It's out of understanding just how brutal this fight becomes when we aim too high, too fast. He turned his gaze directly toward Jasmine now. I admire your fire, but fire alone won't burn through the walls they've built. They've been preparing for this battle long before you and I walk through these doors. Jasmine didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Then slowly she stepped forward, her heels clicking like gunfire in the chamber's hush. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave her arms. But the pressure in her words hit like steel against concrete. Senator Sanders, she said, her voice even, you just made the most powerful case for radical change and then asked us to pause. Her tone sharpened. You said they fought back against FDR. Yes, they did. You said they used fear tactics, lies, even plotted a coup. Yes, but the part you didn't say, the part I'm here to say, is that he did it anyway. He pushed through. And we remember him not for the backlash, but for the backbone. She looked out at the room now, as if daring the walls themselves to argue. We say we want change, but we keep designing it not to offend the people it's supposed to hold accountable. She raised her hand slightly, not to signal, but to emphasize. Every time someone stands up and says the rich should pay their share, the warning goes up like clockwork. Don't push too far, or they'll crush us. And that fear is the reason those changes never come. It is the single most effective weapon the elite have ever deployed. Not money, not media, hesitation. Her voice didn't shake. It struck. I didn't come to Congress to manage inequality like it's a budget item. I came to dismantle the systems that perpetuate it. And I will not ask the people dying from poverty, rationing insulin, or working 3 jobs to wait while we fine-tune a strategy to keep the rich comfortable. She walked a few steps closer to Bernie now, just enough to make the air between them crackle with tension. You've spent your life fighting this fight, but I need you to hear me. This generation is done waiting for permission from a system that profits from their silence. And if you think we'll lose because we dared to go big, then I ask you, what exactly have we won by going small? She paused there, letting the question thunder louder than any shout. If fear was going to protect the working class, it would have by now, but it hasn't, and it won't. Her eyes didn't blink. The only thing fear has done is buy time for billionaires. She stepped back, chin high, not in defiance, but in full command. And as silence fell once more, the war wasn't theoretical anymore. It was personal. It was now. As the echoes of her confrontation with Bernie faded into the silence of reckoning, Jasmine didn't let the weight of history paralyze her. She weaponized it. With the fire of defiance behind her, she pivoted, not away from the battlefield, but toward the future she refused to let die in theory. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward once more, the lights above throwing sharp shadows across her face, but not her resolve. Let me make something absolutely clear, she began, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. This conversation is not just about what we've been through. It's about what we refuse to accept one day longer. She held up a new folder, a different one, its cover emblazoned not with scandals or leaks, but a word that still made too many in the room flinch. Welfare. I'm not here to nibble around the edges. I'm here to build something bigger than fear, something rooted in justice. And it starts with a bold, unapologetic, fully funded social safety net. She tapped the folder once against the lectern and opened it to a slide. Bright, clean, data-heavy, Denmark's welfare spending per capita. In Denmark, taxes on high income hover around 55%. And what do people get? Universal health care, free college, public housing that doesn't look like punishment, parental leave that doesn't bankrupt families, retirement that doesn't mean poverty. She stepped aside, letting the numbers hang in the air. They tax the rich, yes, but more importantly, they invest in their people. Her tone sharpened. Meanwhile, in America, we tax the middle class and let billionaires build rocket ships while kids drink lead-contaminated water. She flipped to another slide, 2 bar graphs side by side. One labeled U.S. Billionaire Wealth Growth, 2020 to 2023. The other, Number of Americans living below the poverty line. The contrast was grotesque. This is not a crisis of capacity, it's a crisis of will. Jasmine's hands grip the edge of the lectern now. And the question isn't whether we can afford it. The question is, how long are we going to keep pretending that we can afford not to? She nodded toward a gallery member wearing an oxygen tube. When you ration insulin because some hedge fund is playing Monopoly with your life, that's a policy choice. When you graduate college with $200,000 in debt just for the crime of wanting an education, that's a policy choice. She took a breath, not to soften, but to reset. Let me tell you what my proposal looks like. Her tone was calm now, but charged with purpose. A national wealth tax on all assets over $50 million, modeled after the policies of Sweden and Norway. That revenue feeds into a federal education fund, universal pre-K, free community college, and tuition-free public universities. We'll use it to build 2 million new public housing units, repair another 3 million, and end homelessness among veterans and children within 5 years. She raised her eyes, daring them to challenge her math. This isn't fantasy. This is arithmetic. Once we stop designing our tax code to protect yachts instead of babies. A new slide. This time it wasn't data, it was faces. Children in underfunded classrooms, elderly women in food pantry lines, nurses on strike holding signs that read, "Patience before profits." Jasmine's voice dropped, but the power in it swelled. This country spends more per capita on healthcare than any nation on earth, and yet we have the worst outcomes in the industrialized world. Because it's not a healthcare system, it's a profit machine. She slammed the folder shut. I'm done asking poor people to subsidize the comforts of the wealthy. We're flipping the formula. Then she delivered the final pivot, one that brought the room to an uneasy stillness. You want to talk about the Nordic model? Fine. She leaned into the mic. Those countries didn't just achieve lower inequality. They achieved higher trust, lower crime, better mental health outcomes, longer life expectancy. Because when a nation invests in its people, it becomes a place worth believing in. She pointed again at the data. You don't get riots when the people have roofs. You don't get despair when the people have dignity. A single beat passed before she added, slower now. We've accepted a false gospel that says asking billionaires to pay their share is un-American. But you know what's un-American? Her eyes locked onto the cameras. A child in Mississippi dying of asthma because the air is poisoned. A working mother in Detroit choosing between rent and chemotherapy. A teacher in Arizona buying pencils out of her own paycheck. She straightened up, unapologetic. This is the richest country in the history of civilization, and we are failing by design. She let that silence hang, not to pause, but to signal that the next breath would be action. This proposal isn't radical. The neglect is. This redistribution isn't dangerous. The hoarding is. And if we truly want to build back better, we can't build on a foundation of hunger and unpaid bills. We must build on fairness, on contribution, on the kind of justice that doesn't trickle down, it rises up. And then her final words, cut clean through the chamber like a verdict. We've spent decades asking, how much can we cut? Now it's time to ask, how much can we care? Jasmine's voice had just finished echoing off the chamber walls, a call to arms so fierce it felt like it could split marble. But as the adrenaline quieted into breathless tension, it was Bernie who stepped forward, not as an opponent, but as the voice of caution forged from 1,000 legislative battles lost to haste. Bernie Sanders didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply leaned into the microphone, his fingers wrapped tightly around the edges of the podium, like someone gripping the wheel of a ship in rough water. Let me be clear, he began slowly, every syllable carrying the weight of decades in the fight. I have stood where you stand, Congresswoman. I have felt that fire, burned by it, led by it. But I've also watched it be extinguished, not by injustice, but by impatience. A hush settled again, not of dismissal, but of reckoning. Bernie's voice deepened. In 2017, Donald Trump signed into law one of the most reckless tax overhauls this country has ever seen. A $1.9 trillion windfall for the ultra-wealthy passed in just 7 weeks. No hearings, no expert reviews, no transparency. And the result? Not growth, not opportunity, a rigged explosion of inequality. Corporate buybacks skyrocketed, wages flatlined, the deficit ballooned. But do you know what was worse? He paused, scanning the room. The public backlash faded. People stopped paying attention because they never understood what had been done to them. It happened too fast, and the damage was too quiet. He exhaled, measured and grim. If we try to reverse that with a revolution just as hasty, however noble, we risk the same fate. We risk reforms built on weak foundations, policies that crumble at the first swing of a right-wing majority. We risk empowering those very forces we seek to defeat by giving them ammunition to paint us as radicals rather than reformers. Jasmine's face stayed composed, but the flicker in her eyes revealed her restraint. Bernie continued, unflinching. This isn't about ideology, this is about durability. If we want to rebuild the tax code in the name of justice, we must do it with steel, not sentiment, with legal armor, airtight data, and public backing so strong that no amount of dark money or media distortion can tear it down. He tapped his stack of papers. That means strategic phasing. It means starting with ironclad reforms, closing offshore loopholes, enforcing corporate minimum taxes, auditing the top 1% with full funding for the IRS. We build public trust there. Then we advance. Wealth taxes, capital levies, full progressive restructuring. But we don't blow through the gates without making sure the bridge can hold. The tension in the room didn't ease, but it shifted. Bernie wasn't shrinking from the fight. He was trying to make sure it lasted. Then gently he added, Congresswoman Crockett, I admire your fire. I've waited a lifetime to see leaders like you emerge, but if we act without anchoring our vision in the realities of political backlash, we won't just lose the battle. We'll make it harder for the next generation to even try. Jasmine stepped forward again, her heels striking the floor like punctuation. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. When she spoke, her tone was calmer, but just as electric. Senator Sanders, she began, I do not disagree with your facts. I disagree with what we've been trained to do because of those facts. Her hands opened in frustration and conviction. We keep talking about backlashes like they're worse than injustice, like it's better to move slowly through suffering than to risk waking the people who cause it. She gestured toward the gallery again, where a mother sat holding a toddler wrapped in a medical blanket. That child doesn't have 10 years for strategic consensus. That mother doesn't need another pilot program or bipartisan delay. What she needs is courage from people in this room, not just from me, from you, from all of us. But then Jasmine surprised the room. Her voice softened, not in defeat, but in maturity. That said, I know fire without foundation burns itself out. I'm not here to burn. I'm here to build. And if what you're offering is a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of justice, then I will meet you there, but not an inch behind it. Bernie looked at her, and for the first time that day there was no conflict in his eyes. Only gravity, a tired, aching kind of hope. He leaned forward again. Then let's draft it, together. There was no applause, no music swelled, but something in the room shifted, a fragile kind of power, not yet victorious, but finally aligned. Two warriors, two visions, now one purpose, a tax code that serves the people, and a nation no longer built on hoarded wealth, but on shared dignity. As the echoes of consensus settled into the wood-paneled silence, Jasmine Crockett rose again, not to win the argument, but to carve the closing words into the conscience of a nation. She stood slowly, not as a legislator requesting attention, but as a force stepping into her full, undiluted fire. The marble walls of the hearing chamber seemed to tighten around her, as if the room itself knew this moment was about more than policy. Jasmine took the floor not with hesitance, but with the calm of someone who had carried too many truths for too long to speak softly now. Her voice began, low and tempered. What we've done here today, she said, pausing as eyes fixed on her, is not enough. But it matters. It matters because we didn't just trade speeches. We drew lines. We showed this nation what happens when truth enters a room that's used to silence. She glanced around the chamber, past Bernie, past the cameras, and toward the gallery where ordinary citizens sat like shadows of the stories never told. But we are not done, because for every dollar hoarded offshore, for every billionaire's yacht untaxed, and every single mom's groceries taxed to the bone, there is a child, a veteran, a teacher, a worker, waiting for justice that always seems to arrive too late or not at all. She held up a document, one sheet, a chart, but not one of abstract GDP curves. This one came from the IRS. A simple breakdown. Amazon's 1.2% tax rate versus the 22% average paid by middle-income families? This is not oversight, she said coldly. This is engineered betrayal, and we've allowed it because we fear the backlash more than we fear the consequences of inaction. She leaned into the mic now, her voice sharp. They tell us to be cautious, to wait, to aim for what's politically viable. But I ask you, was slavery ended by what was viable? Was civil rights won by what was safe? Did FDR build the New Deal by asking J.P. Morgan if they approved? The chamber held its breath. Every empire of injustice is built on two things: silence and delay. And every time this body tells the American people, we need more time, what we really mean is, we're letting the corporations write the clock. She stepped out from behind the desk. Her heels echoed like warning shots. Look around you. Look at the headlines. Look at the lobbyists who'll flood this room tomorrow with smiles and veiled threats. Look at the men who have turned tax evasion into national sport, whose idea of contribution is buying another senator's vote. A flicker of pain passed across her face, a wound carried, not shown. And still, we hesitate. She reached into her folder again and pulled a child's drawing, done in crayon, a stick figure standing beside a tall woman in a blue dress. The caption? Ms. Jasmine helps moms like mine. Her hands didn't shake, but her voice softened. This was mailed to my office from a housing project in Dallas, a place where the school had to cancel lunch programs because of budget cuts tied directly to corporate tax breaks. She folded the drawing carefully, reverently. I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to remind you what this costs. Every time we postpone action in the name of strategy, we choose wealth over people. Every time we water down our bills to satisfy donors, we are saying that campaign checks matter more than chemotherapy. Her next breath came slow, but volcanic. To those watching who call this radical, let me say this. It is radical to let billionaires dodge taxes while children sleep in cars. It is radical to call this a democracy while letting two hedge funds own most of our media. It is radical to tell people in Flint to drink poison while ExxonMobil rakes in billions in subsidies. A silence, thick as grief, filled the air. But here's the truth, Jasmine said, lifting her chin. This fight is not just winnable, it is inevitable. Because justice always finds its reckoning. The only question is, will we be remembered as the ones who delayed it, or the ones who dared to deliver it? She turned toward Bernie now. Her voice didn't challenge, it invited. We may differ in tempo, Senator Sanders, but I believe in your integrity, and I ask that you believe in my urgency. Let's not let another year pass with toothless reforms and bipartisan eulogies. Let's write legislation with backbone. Let's craft tax law that remembers who built this country, not just who owns it. She stepped back to the desk and laid her palm flat on its oak surface. To every member of Congress in this room, and to every American listening, I don't want your applause. I want your courage. I want your vote, not because it's safe, but because it's right. Then her voice dipped, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like glass. This may be just another hearing to some of you, but to the family evicted last night, to the teacher skipping insulin to buy supplies for her classroom, to the veteran waiting in a broken VA lobby, this is the moment that will define whether we were complicit or we finally rose. Her closing line landed with the weight of scripture. We were not elected to protect the powerful. We were sent here to confront them. And with that, Jasmine Crockett didn't sit. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the hearing chamber. A silhouette of defiance wrapped in resolve. No one moved. No one spoke. Because for that one instant in American political theater, The script was broken, and the truth, naked and undeniable, stood center stage. As the weight of Jasmine's words still lingered in the air like smoke after a battlefield volley, Bernie Sanders slowly leaned forward, not to extinguish the fire, but to anchor it in the long, hard soil of persistence. His fingers curled around the microphone, not trembling, but firm, like hands that had gripped the rails of 1,000 uphill climbs. The chamber was still electrified, the silence brittle. Bernie cleared his throat, not out of weakness, but out of reverence for the storm that had just passed. And then, with the steady cadence of a man who had seen decades rise and fall on Capitol Hill, he spoke. "My friends," he began, his tone softer than Jasmine's but no less resolute. "We just heard a voice of righteous urgency, and make no mistake, that urgency is justified. The pain is real. The injustice is staggering. But I ask you to remember this. The road to justice has never been paved in one day." His eyes scanned the room, not just to meet glances, but to measure resolve. It takes steps. It takes sweat. It takes staying in the fight even when the headlines move on. He raised a hand, not to silence, but to clarify. "Let me be clear. I have no disagreement with the spirit of my colleagues' words. We must fight for the working class. We must tax the wealthy. We must dismantle the oligarchy that has hijacked our democracy. But the history of progress teaches us something vital, that if we swing too wildly, too fast, they will shut the doors before we've even stepped through." There was no condescension in his voice, only the rough weariness of someone who had learned this the hard way. He leaned in now, his words gaining volume. In the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was called a traitor to his class because he dared to tax the wealthy. And even then, he was nearly broken by corporate lobbies. The New Deal was not a single law. It was a movement built one plank at a time over years through strikes, protests, and negotiations. And still today, pieces of it are being clawed apart. His voice cracked slightly, but not from age, from conviction. We cannot afford to lose what little we've built. We must move forward, but we must move forward in a way that survives the backlash. Because believe me, it's coming. He pointed to the gallery above. Right now, billionaires are watching this hearing, not in fear, but in calculation. They are funding PACs. They are mobilizing think tanks. They are calling senators with threats wrapped in politeness. They are building counter-legislation before our ink even dries. He paused. And if we overreach without securing the battlefield, we will lose this war. Not because we were wrong, but because we weren't ready. Then he shifted, not away from principle, but toward unity. That is why I'm asking every person here, every citizen watching, every legislator with a spine, do not walk away from this debate thinking it is Jasmine's plan or mine. It is both of ours. It is every honest worker's. It is every overworked nurse's. It is every student drowning in debt and every elder choosing between rent and medicine. He lifted a folder of handwritten letters, dozens. I carry these with me, notes from people in Flint, in Appalachia, in Southside Chicago, in forgotten zip codes in boarded-up towns. They don't care if we pass reform in the name of Crockett or Sanders. They just want to know if we're still fighting for them. He paced slightly, his steps deliberate, grounded. The question before us is not whether we want justice. That answer is clear. The question is whether we will build a strategy that can outlast the resistance, one that turns popular anger into legislative pressure, one that survives the midterms, the smear ads, the lobbyist campaigns. Then his voice softened unexpectedly. You see, my friends, change is not just a moment. It's a series of choices, and we stand at a fork, down one road, boldness without coordination and risk of collapse. Down the other, cautious endurance and the chance to build something that lasts. He took a breath, then spoke slowly. I am not asking anyone here to slow down. I am asking you to hold fast, hold to your principles, hold to each other, hold to the people who sent us here. Not the headlines, not the fundraisers, not the donors. Them. The people. He turned to Jasmine with a nod. Not concession, not submission, but deep, strategic respect. Congresswoman Crockett fights with a fire we need, And if we pair that fire with a foundation, then there is no force, no lobby, no billionaire, no party machine that can stop us. Then he faced the chamber fully once more. So let's march together. Let us craft tax policy that bleeds corruption out of this economy. Let us fund the schools, the clinics, the homes our people deserve. Let us build coalitions so wide they cannot be ignored, so diverse they cannot be divided. He raised a hand, not in defense, but as a call. Do not mistake gradualism for surrender. When we pass one bill, just one, to close a loophole that steals billions from the Treasury, we strike a blow against the empire of greed. When we fund one community clinic from fair taxes, we crack the foundation of inequality. Change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's relentless. Bernie's voice found its final height now, not booming, but grounded in grit. So yes, let's be impatient in our hearts. Let's burn with justice. But let's build like architects, not arsonists. Let's carve this mountain inch by inch until the summit is not a dream, but a road. And then, after a beat of silence, he delivered his final line, not with drama, but with gravity. Because the poor can't wait, but neither can they afford for us to fail. He sat down, not to yield, but to hand off the baton to everyone in the room. The room did not erupt. It tightened, with the shared realization that there were no heroes here, only responsibilities. And in that moment, under the dome of a capital too often ruled by inertia, strategy finally shook hands with urgency. As Bernie's final appeal for gradualism hung in the air, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the moral weight of the entire debate. Jasmine didn't stand again, but her silence carried the force of everything unspoken. The time for caution had already cost too much. What remained was not a clash of policies, but a confrontation with conscience. Jasmine Crockett had not just presented data, she had dragged injustice out of the shadows and into the hearing lights. Her arguments had peeled away the decorum that often hides brutality and bureaucracy. What was left, exposed and undeniable, was a system designed to protect those who already had more than they needed, at the expense of those who had never had enough to survive. The lesson wasn't buried in charts. It pulsed through every example she cited, every name she invoked, every loophole she shattered. She wasn't speaking to win a debate. She was speaking for people who couldn't afford to lose another generation. Her moral warning was simple. If we keep waiting for the perfect moment, we are letting injustice win in real time. Jasmine had spoken of Amazon paying just 1.2% in taxes, of billionaires offshoring wealth, while working-class families live paycheck to paycheck. But those facts were more than shocking. They were personal indictments of national failure. The tax code wasn't neutral, it was rigged. And in every deduction granted to a corporation, there was a service denied to a citizen. She refused to let that injustice stay invisible. Her voice had carried a deeper call. To recognize that inaction is not neutrality, it's complicity. The real divide wasn't between left and right. It was between those willing to challenge power and those too comfortable to care. And that was her most dangerous message of all. Because Jasmine didn't just call out the rich, she called out the system that enabled them. The senators who looked away, the voters who shrugged, the media that normalized suffering. She turned the entire hearing into a mirror and forced everyone watching to see who they really were in the reflection. But even in that harsh light, she offered a different kind of hope. Not one of handouts, but of reckoning, of restoring balance, of taking what had been hoarded through injustice and using it to build something fair. Her lesson wasn't vengeance. It was redemption through courage. She spoke of Denmark's tax-funded social programs, not as fantasy, but as proof. She reminded them that justice was possible, but only when morality had more power than money. You can't serve the people, she'd said, if you're too afraid to upset the powerful. That wasn't politics. That was a warning, and the chamber knew it. Because Jasmine's closing moments weren't the end of a debate. They were the beginning of a line in the sand. Her message was clear. Either we confront the system now, or we remain accessories to its cruelty. There would be no passive role left to play, no applause line to hide behind. The injustice had been documented, the stakes had been named, the blood price had been counted. And for those who chose silence now, history would remember them accordingly. That was the deepest lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind in that echoing hall. That morality, real morality, is disruptive. It demands that we risk our comfort, that we break with tradition, that we challenge not just the villains, but the structure that made villainy profitable. And in doing so, she hadn't just changed the tone of the hearing. She had changed the terms of the fight, not left versus right, not radical versus moderate, but cowardice versus conviction. And she had made her side unmistakably clear. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.